Well, you know, you never know.
Did you hear the one about you're the one with the library guy?
No, I'm not going viral. I'm not. We're good. All right. Welcome everyone here and in YouTube land. My name is Marty Acketts, and I'm the Adult Programming Coordinator for Peter White Public Library, and I'm also the NEA Big Read Organizer for Peter White. And it's my pleasure and honor to introduce tonight's NEA Big Read keynote speaker, Dr. Amy Hamilton, who will be discussing climate in American Indian literature. The process of putting together the grant for the NEA Big Read was really long and involved. Reaching out, and I had to reach out to many different organizations and people who are experts in their fields. I sent emails to poets and musicians and librarians and scholars and environmental activists and artists. And without fail, when I explained I can take this off. When I explained the focus and aim of the NEA Big Read here at Peter White Public Library, namely An American Sunrise by U.S. Poet Laureate Joy Harjo, every person I contacted immediately agreed to become a part of the programming. And my colleague here at Northern Michigan University, Amy Hamilton, was one of the first people I reached out to. And she was one of the first people who agreed to be a keynote presenter way back in January of 2021. So this past January. It seems a long, long time ago, like a lifetime ago. And this has been one of the most challenging and fulfilling and I think important things that I've ever been a part of. And I owe the success of the NEA Big Read here at Peter White Public Library to people like Amy, who are willing to share their talents and insights and passions. So let me tell you a little bit about Amy. Amy received her master's and PhD in English Lit from the University of Arizona. Her scholarly work includes essays on Indigenous American writers, U.S. Southwest border literatures, and literature and environment. Her monograph, Peregrinations, Walking in American Literature, was published by the University of Nevada Press in 2018. Engaging the methodologies of material eco-criticism, Native American studies, and feminist studies, Peregrinations explores the trope and experience of walking in American texts from a cross-cultural perspective. She's also co-edited a critical collection, Before the West Was West, Critical Essays on Pre-1800 Literature of the American Frontiers, also from the University of Nebraska Press in 2014. This collection investigates a range of early literatures and poses new questions about Westernness and its literary representation. Dr. Hamilton's recent courses at NMU include Native American oral traditions, Introduction to Gender and Sexuality in Literature, American Literature, Emergent National Voices, 1800 to 1865, and also Eco-Criticism and Environmental Justice. Amy is also the editor of the scholarly journal Western American Literature, published by the Western Literature Association. Western American Literature is the leading peer-reviewed journal in the literary and cultural study of the North American West. And before I turn things over to her, I've been trying to start out every single one of these presentations with a poem that I think is appropriate for the evening and the topic. And so this, I'm going to read you a portion of a poem, a longer poem by Joy Harjo called Exile of Memory. And this is one of the sections of it, and I think it really speaks to what Amy's going to be talking on tonight. So this is an excerpt from An Exile of Memory. In the complex here, there is a singing tree. It sings of the history of trees here. It sings of Manoe, that is Joy Harjo's grandfather, who stood with his warrior friends on the overlook, staring into the new town erected by illegal residents. It sings of the Civil War camp, the bloodied, the self-righteous, and the forsaken. It sings of atomic power and the rise of banks whose spires mark the worship places. The final verse is always the trees. They will remain. Please join me in welcoming tonight's NEA Big Read keynote speaker, my scholar friend and scholar, writer, and my friend, Dr. Amy Hamilton.
All right. Thank you so much, Marty. And thank you, everybody, for coming this evening. Thank you to the Peter White Public Library, to the NEA Big Read program for this incredible series of events over the last month. It's been such a joy, and I think such an enriching experience for our community. So thank you so much for spearheading this, Marty. It's been fabulous. And thank you to the other presenters whose work I've been enjoying over the last month. It is such an honor to be part of this program with all of you. Chimugwich, thank you to the Anishinaabe, on whose traditional and contemporary homelands we meet this evening. And thank you to the Indigenous nations from whose territories any YouTube viewers are watching from. For example, the Tewa, in whose southwestern lands my family live, who I think are on this evening. During her presentation a couple of weeks ago, April Lindela made a call to acknowledge our own positionality. Right? She was talking about the kind of land acknowledgement that I just made, but also thinking more deeply than that. Who are we on this land? What does that mean? So I'm going to identify my own positionality in relationship to the text that I'm going to be talking about. I am a settler colonist. I am the descendant of immigrants, both more recent immigrants from the last 100 years or so, from Ireland, Scotland, England, and Hungary, as well as one branch of the family that stretches back to the Puritan Great Migration of 1620 to 1640. My family and I have benefited and continue to benefit in real concrete ways from the historical and ongoing colonization of the land that is now commonly called the United States. As a scholar who teaches and writes about Indigenous literatures, who strives to be ethical and respectful, awareness of subject positioning is something I take very seriously. What I bring to the conversation tonight, I start with humility. I bring listening and learning, critical thinking, and my experience as a literary scholar. What I cannot bring is firsthand cultural experience or knowledge. So given that subject positioning, why this topic? Why am I here standing in front of you talking about these things? I grew up in the American Southwest, immersed in the land and surrounded by the stories about the land and the people who live there, whether for decades, centuries, or since the beginning. Connection to the land and the stories have been a part of who I am for my whole life. This became very clear to me as an undergraduate student at Pomona College in California when I was tasked with coming up for a topic for my undergraduate thesis. And I cast about looking at all of the things that interested my professors and things that I had enjoyed, and I just couldn't quite hit on the right topic. And then I turned homeward. And I realized that I wanted to write about the land and literature of the Southwest. So my undergraduate thesis became a work on Indigenous and Chicanx authors' representation of land and gender, including the poetry from Joy Harjo's first book, She Had Some Horses. This project led to my graduate work in Indigenous and Western literature through the lens of eco-criticism at the University of Arizona, and to my career at NMU. Turning to the topic for tonight's talk, climate in Indigenous American literature is a very obviously capacious topic. It goes on from the beginning of from pre-written traditions, from hide paintings, petroglyphs and pictographs, basket and blanket weaving, pottery decoration, jewelry, and more, through oral traditions, including creation stories, trickster tales, hunting stories, and beyond. In more recent years, climate and Indigenous literature has stretched into the world of Indigenous cli-fi, or climate fiction, and Indigenous futurisms. So understanding this incredible range of Indigenous writings and cultural expressions that evoke climate, today I'm going to focus mostly on how Tona A'odham author Ophelia Zepeda, Laguna author Leslie Marmon Silko, and Kumeyaay author Tommy Pico write about rain and drought in the U.S. Desert West. All in with return to Joy Harjo's work. So what follows is largely drawn from a chapter I wrote for a critical anthology about climate and US literature. But before I get to the literature, let me paint you a picture as we sit here in this community room in November on the shore of Lake Superior, enjoying the last days of 60-degree weather. Summer in the Sonoran Desert is hot. The yellow sun bakes the caliche in the sandstone, drying sweat almost before it forms. The air shimmers as heat rises in waves from the packed earth. The blue sky is bleached white. Caught in the breathless inertia of June, birds, insects, animals, and humans dream of rain. Rain in the desert is more than just a respite from the stifling heat. When the monsoon rains come in July and August, they bring with them the promise of continued life and the ongoing cycle of desert seasons. Tona Adam, poet and scholar, Ophelia Zepeda, writes of growing up in the Sonoran Desert, where her mother and aunts, quote, planned their day around the heat and the coolness of the summer day. They knew the climate and felt confident in it. They knew the weather and its movements. Zepeda explains how the women watch for the rain, noticing changes, quote, even before the clouds become visible. The other sensory nerves are affected. The odor of wet dirt precedes the rain. Zepeda's family understands the climate of the desert intimately, folding it into their daily lives at a level deeper than conscious thought. They reflect a depth of knowing born of thousands of years of experience, thousands of years of relationship with the more than human desert. Crucially, in Zepeda's depiction, the Tono O'odham women in her family do not passively wait for the rain. They act. The women participate in a ceremony to bring the rain, using their saguaro hooks to coax rain to the thirsty earth. So saguaro hooks are long, hooked poles that Tono O'odham people would traditionally and still use to harvest the fruit of the saguaro cactus. And the saguaro cactus are those cactuses that are familiar from Peanuts cartoons and Western movies that reach up into the sky and can reach heights of up to 70 feet tall. And so they use these hooks to hook the fruit from the very crown of the saguaro. Zepeda writes about this process in her bilingual poem, Pulling Down the Clouds. Because I don't speak Tono O'odham language, I'm only going to read the English portion, but know that the poem alternates between the two languages with each line change. So Zepeda writes, with my harvesting stick, I will hook the clouds. With my harvesting stick, I will pull down the clouds. With my harvesting stick, I will stir the clouds. In this poem, Zepeda crafts a song poem deeply connected to O'odham cosmologies, centered crucially on the relationships between people, place, language, and climate. So the act of harvesting the fruit of the saguaro is both an endpoint for the growing season, pulling down those fruit at the end of the fruit's life, and a part of the continuation of the cycles of growth because it brings the rain, right? It starts the next growing season by bringing the rain. The O'odham, Zepeda's poem insists, have a reciprocal responsibility in the continuance of the earth. This understanding of humans' role in the creation and maintenance of climate on Earth is echoed across the Americas, as articulated by writers such as Leanne Simpson, Kim Tallbear, Kyle White, Simon Ortiz, and many, many others. By the way, there is a reading list that I put on the back table with some of the books I'm going to be talking about, and some others on there as well. Author and educator Gregory Kahete, who's Tewa, explains that, quote, native science is a collective heritage of human experience with the natural world. In its most essential form, it is a map of natural reality drawn from the experience of thousands of human generations. This experience, he explains, includes areas familiar to Western science such as ecology, astronomy, and biology, but it also draws on spirituality, community, language, creativity, and emotions. In other words, quote, the nature of human relationship to the cosmos. That was Kahete again. Kahete explains that Indigenous science is founded on the ancient human covenant with plants, animals, and the forces of the earth and the universe. This covenant centers relationships and recognizes the interlocking systems on which all life relies. Further, the covenant is rooted in scientific and ethical considerations. So scholars Joni Adamson and Salma Manani explain that Indigenous cosmovisions articulate dynamic epistemologies and present sound ethical and scientific reasoning for ecological conservation. So at the heart of of many indigenous cosmovisions is a deep conception of what they term, Adamson and Monani term, eco-cultural entanglements of humans with non-human. The compacts differ among peoples because they are dependent on the specifics of climate and ecology in each place and are created and reflected in ceremonies and stories, which emphasize, as Gerald Visner, who's Anishinaabe, contends, that tribal creation takes place at the time of the telling. So each time the ceremony is performed, each time the O'odam hook down the clouds and hook down the fruit, that relationship is repeated, the covenant is renewed for another season, for another year. The complexity of human roles and responsibilities in the health and continuance of Earth and all of its life has been explored by indigenous writers and activists from a wide variety of perspectives, from things like indigenous food sovereignty, the incorporation of traditional ecological knowledge into K-12 education, and activism surrounding extraction industries such as the Canadian tar sands, oil fracking, uranium mining, and central to my comments this evening, water. Water holds a special place within many indigenous American cosmovisions. As the guiding principle of the No DAPL, or No Dakota Access Pipeline protest at Standing Rock reminds us, water is life, and perhaps some of you are familiar with that very famous poster from Standing Rock that says just that, water is life. This refrain, simple though it appears, represents a complex vision of indigenous climate science. Water is, of course, necessary for the physical survival of all beings. That's a given. Yet water is life also points to a deeper truth embedded in indigenous oral traditions. Water, in the form of clouds, rain, rivers, lakes, and seas, in many cases precedes the appearance of humans in indigenous creation stories. In these cosmovisions, the old and profound relationship between humans and water is the fundamental compact on which all others rely. That's the heart of the relationship between humans and the rest of the world, is water. So agricultural runoff and contamination from industry pollute the water, impact habitat, and enter the food chain. Meanwhile, a rapidly changing climate means longer and more severe droughts, as well as heavier snowfall and more violent storm surges. Water acts as a barometer of climate health. Contamination of the water and disruption of the water cycle indicate a climate frighteningly out of balance. So authors like Ophelia Zepeda, Leslie Marmon-Silko, Tommy Pico, and Joy Harjo engage these concerns by centering an ethics of responsibility, connecting characters and their current conflicts of drought and or environmental degradation to story traditions about the perils of imbalance and the repercussions of human greed. So the life of the water represented by seasonal rains and drought reminds readers of the vital roles that humans and the more than human world play in the climate cycles that support environmental well-being. So turning now to Leslie Marmon-Silko and her novel Ceremony. In this novel, drought is both a key metaphor and a reality of life in the desert. Silko's novel draws attention backward through traditional stories of the Laguna people's vast experience with drought and forwards to stories of drought linked to imbalances in the contemporary world. The narrative weaves Laguna to oral tradition into a story about a young Laguna man, his name is Teo, who has recently returned to Laguna Pueblo in northwest New Mexico from a harrowing experience in World War II. Teo, survivor of the Bataan Death March and a Japanese prisoner of war camp, suffers from what the white VA doctors identify as shell shock. However, it quickly becomes clear that Teo's illness is more complex than the doctors can comprehend and is mirrored by a desert drought, an association that underscores the long history of colonialism and the even longer relations between the Laguna people and their traditional homelands and sacred places. The novel describes a traditional Laguna environmental ethic that must contend with the power inequities of the contemporary world that determine which communities are impacted most by environmental destruction and climate change. The form of the novel reinforces the covenant between humans and the more than human cosmos. Traditional Laguna stories, in the form of long poems, are intertwined with the story of Teo's journey to wellness. The most notable of these poems, because it's like the longest, tells of Hummingbird and Fly, who are tasked with appeasing Corn Mother so that she will end a deadly drought. They succeed by relying on a cascade of connected relationships. So Fly and Hummingbird visit Corn Mother and ask her to return, but she requires them to find Buzzard to purify the town. In turn, Buzzard asks for an offering of tobacco, which they must procure from Caterpillar. So thus, the process of ending the drought involves the participation of many different beings and many different kinds of offerings. Returning again to Gregory Cajete, this is part of what he describes as vertical and horizontal processes that are constantly interweaving with each other to create reality. So the poem's placement in Teo's story emphasizes connections of theme and character. So for example, following a section of the poem about flies' role in ending drought is Teo's memory of a childhood lesson his uncle Josiah taught him. When Josiah finds Teo killing flies, he reminds his nephew of the traditional story. So in Josiah's retelling, he focuses on the green bottle fly. So he says, the animals disappeared, the plants disappeared, and no rain came for a long time. It was the green bottle fly who went to her, asking forgiveness for the people. Since that time, the people have been grateful for what the fly did for us. This lesson results in Teo laying aside the fly swatter and worrying over the consequences of his actions. But the longer lesson that Josiah teaches concerns the complex relationships between human and more than human in the maintenance of climate balance. Ceremony demonstrates that climate is part of an active series of relationships and events, and survival depends on a deep understanding about how to relate to the more than human world. Teo begins to understand through the course of the novel that in order to alleviate his own suffering and the suffering of those around him, the other young men who have returned from World War II with some pretty horrible experiences, he must find a way to reconnect with the land and reestablish balance in himself, among his people, and in the parched desert homeland. Throughout the novel, this dense layering of stories calls attention to the contract between humans and the more than human world to maintain balance and bring rain. This layering is clear when Teo catalogs the complex causes of drought. He muses that following World War II, years of drought afflicted the desert, quote, as they had after the First World War, when he was a child and they had to haul water to keep the sheep in big wooden barrels in the old wagon. Teo follows the connection between drought and war with a recollection of the Bataan Death March. During the Bataan Death March, which was through the jungle, the rain contributed to the prisoners' suffering as it rained and rained and rained as they struggled along this march. And during that time, Teo prays the rain away, an act that he links directly to the drought in Laguna. He notes that, quote, for the 6th year it was dry. The grass turned yellow and it did not grow. Wherever he looked, Teo could see the consequences of his praying. He cried for all of them and for what he had done. So the novel interrupts this memory with a traditional Laguna story about Reed Woman taking the rain away when she was scolded by her sister, Corn Woman. This is the same Corn Woman, but in a little bit of a different guise. The sentences immediately prior to and following the story of Reed Woman and Corn Woman emphasize the power of language. So returning to Teo, all the time he could hear his voice praying against the rain, and so he had prayed the rain away. All of these stories, droughts following war, praying away rain in the jungle, Reed Woman taking away the rain, center on the sacred relationships that, when neglected, result in damage. Teo believes his prayer, like Corn Woman's scolding, is responsible for the thirst and starvation of the people and the animals. As the novel progresses, Teo begins to see these connections between human actions and the more than human world, yet his understanding is incomplete and remains focused on his own experiences, with little grasp of the larger context. In order for him to fully heal, he has to not only understand and recognize those repeated storylines, but also their deeper significance as it pertains to his entire community. So the connections that he's struggling to appreciate are further reflected in the very language used in the stories, reinforcing the Laguna understanding that the climate and the cosmos is maintained through relationships. This detailed mesh is demonstrated in the ceremonial language of Laguna Elder Kuosh, and I'm going to read a little bit of a longer quote from that ceremony. The word he chose to express fragile was filled with the intricacies of a continuing process and with the strength inherent in spider webs woven across paths through sandhills where early in the morning the sun becomes entangled in each filament of web. It took a long time to explain the fragility and intricacy because no word exists alone. And the reason for choosing each word had to be explained with a story about why it must be said this certain way. That was the responsibility that went with being human. So this entanglement of the web and the filament and the words, this is also the entanglement of the multiple stories. This is also the entanglement of the people with the climate and with the land. The whole book is kind of layering these entanglements and insisting on these entanglements all the way through. So this ceremony works to reintegrate Teo into a pattern that incorporates current stories and experiences into a long history of connections and responsibilities that goes into the very language itself. He further starts to understand this through the Dene or Navajo concept of witchery when he visits a notorious Dene elder named Batoni who furthers the ceremony along. He explains that Teo is part of a pattern that began long ago and is part of oral traditions about ending drought by addressing imbalances. Yet his story is also a newer version that has continued to develop since witchery brought about colonialism. Right? So Batoni brings colonialism into that mix, once again linking contemporary experience with traditional stories. Batoni explains to Teo that witchery created white colonists by disassociating them from the earth, that relationship between people and earth and the fracturing of that relationship is the core of colonialism. He tells Teo of an old story that prophesied the harms of environmental degradation. He says, then they, meaning the colonists, grow away from the earth. Then they grow away from the sun. Then they grow away from the plants and the animals. The world is a dead thing for them. As a direct result of this denial of the land, they will poison the water, they will spin the water away, and there will be drought. The people will starve. So here we have yet another explanation for the drought. Batoni emphasizes that the core of witchery is a disruption of the relationships between humans and the more than human world. That imbalance is the thing that is causing the drought, and Teo's illness is deeply rooted in a legacy of colonialism, which itself is a manifestation of witchery. As he comes to the end of his time with Batoni, Teo begins to recognize the connections more clearly. There's a quote from the novel. He took a deep breath of cold mountain air. There were no boundaries. The mountains from all the directions had been gathered there tonight. As he moves through the complicated pattern that Batoni reveals, he becomes increasingly grounded in the stories in the land of Laguna. When he completes his ceremony, he enacts the return of the rain. In the quote from the end of the novel, the transition was completed. In the west and in the south too, the clouds with round, heavy bellies had gathered for dawn. It was not necessary, but it was right. And even if the sky had been cloudless, the end was the same. The ear for the story and the eye for the pattern were theirs. The feeling was theirs. We came out of this land, and we are hers. So even though the promise of rain indicates the success of the ceremony and the reintegration of the people in the land, the true healing is even deeper in the recognition of those responsibilities and relationships. While the ceremonial arc in the novel parallels the traditional stories of bringing the earth and the people back into balance, Batoni's teachings about witchery and colonialism underscore the complexity of the novel and prevent it from falling into what Joni Adamson warns is a damaging stereotype that Indigenous people possess, quote, an ancient wisdom that alone can save the planet. Rather, the novel situates Teo's journey within a history of colonialism specifically as it relates to World War II, uranium mines in Laguna, the development of the atom bomb in Los Alamos, New Mexico, which is just a few dozen miles away from Laguna Pueblo, and the dropping of that bomb on Japanese civilians. In other words, the traditional bases of Indigenous ecological knowledge are not quaint or irrelevant. This long knowing of the world is what allows Teo to recognize and understand contemporary threats to water, land, animals, and people. So understanding indigenous relationships to the more than human world is a vital part of understanding how to address the crisis that has caused our planet to edge ever closer to apocalyptic disaster, to not be too dramatic. However, such discussions are all too easily slide into the trap of the comforting, familiar ecological Indian. And the ecological Indian is perhaps best captured in what many of you may remember, the Keep America Beautiful television ads from the 1970s of Iron Eyes Cody, the ecological Indian with his glycerin tear, right? So that ecological Indian has really taken hold of, and for a long time, has taken hold of the American imagination. As poet Tommy Pico, who's Kumeyaay, which is a California tribe, sardonically asserts in his book-length poem, Nature Poem, I can't write a nature poem because it's fodder for the noble savage narrative. I would slap a tree across the face. Using humor and unexpected imagery, Pico draws his readers' attention to the way romanticized expectations about indigenous people and the more than human world can function to silence individual indigenous voices. These expectations create the belief that we, right, the readers, already understand the relationship between indigenous peoples and the natural world. The narrative of the ecological Indian insists that Indians, in quotation marks, are interested in balance with nature, a mystical understanding that non-Indians have long found both romantic and threatening. The narrative is pat and familiar, and it excuses its adherents from the responsibility of truly considering indigenous cosmologies. So Pico argues, for example, that words like spirit animal have been shifted and colonized until they form what he calls a dry barrier to others that, quote, suggest indigenous religion and spirituality is ridiculous. Pico combats these preconceptions and stereotypes by playing with the idea of the dry barrier and polluted waters. He reimagines what it means to listen to the more than human. And this is where my content warning comes. There is a bad word. Here is a short, peaceful pastoral lyric, he tells us. Crappy water shoots through Purgatory Creek on its way to the Colorado River. My bad, says the EPA after accidentally dumping 3 million gallons of waste into the stream. Fuck you too, says nature. Pico's use of language inflected by texting, because shows up as BC, and colloquial slang like my bad, not to mention swearing, locates the concerns of his poetry in the hyper-contemporary moment. There is no relegating this speaker into a romantic past. Further, by highlighting his own discomfort with the stereotype of the ecological Indian, the speaker distances himself from sentimentality and cliché. Thus, when he engages in ecological concerns, he does so in a way that simultaneously roots those concerns in the long stretch of indigenous experience with the U.S. and maintains focus on the concerns of people living in our postmodern present. So nature speaks not in a hazy romantic voice of the ecological Indian, but in irreverent confidence. Alongside the repeated claim that he cannot write a nature poem, Pico frequently returns to the subject of water and drought in California, the homeland of the Kumeyaay. I feel as dry as California, Pico writes, where I somehow managed to thrive in a climate of drought for thousands of years without draining the state, yet somehow we were primitive. Through his use of first-person pronouns in this passage, Pico aligns his personal existence with his ancestors' survival over millennia. Right? I somehow managed to thrive. Somehow we were primitive. He contrasts indigenous presence in a climate marked by cyclical drought with the stealing and exploitation of water by Spanish and Euro-American settlers. He reminds his readers of this history. It's hard to unhook the heavy marble nature from around the chain around your neck when history is stolen like water. America learned it scarcely rains in San Diego. Water was a battlefield, and within just 20 years, from 1850 to 1870, the indigenous population fell by 60%. Anthropologists write population decline with a gentle implication of a drying fog. Recourse suggests resources. People say, get over. I read a lot, it's hard, but I'm starting to see the chariot of water. In these lines, Pico connects drought to stolen water and genocide. Whereas the Kumeyaay people have determined how to live and thrive in the desert over thousands of years of experience, Euro-American settlers reacted to the dry climate of the 31st state by stealing what little water there was, which, combined with violent legacies of Spanish colonialism, disrupted the careful balance of generations of Kumeyaay. So Pico reinforces the centrality of water for life by comparing the rhetoric of population decline to something passive and almost incidental, like the contradictory drawing fog. Human death and the loss of water are naturalized and smoothed away. Pico challenges this vision with his allusion to the biblical image of the Chariot of Fire. So in 2 Kings chapter 2, verse 11, the prophet Elijah ascends to heaven in a chariot of fire, an event that strengthened the faith of those left behind and presaged the arrival and eventual ascension of the Messiah. The chariot of fire also appears in Isaiah 66 verses 15 through 16, as a sign of the end of days when the Messiah will return to earth to reestablish God's kingdom. Pico replaces fire with water, locating the cycle of hope, destruction, and renewal within the indigenous context of the desert. So throughout his book, Pico challenges Western truisms and assumptions about the ecological Indian and stereotypes of indigenous peoples living lightly on the land and leaving no trace. As Potawatomi botanist and writer Robin Wall Kimmerer explains, a lot of the time you hear that the best thing people can do for nature is to stay away from it and let it be. There are places where that's absolutely true and our people respect that, but we are also given the responsibility to care for the land. What people forget is that means participating. End quote. So the renewal of the world, the healing of the climate and of the earth must be through the moral covenant of reciprocity. That's Kimmerer again. Whatever our gift, she writes, we are called to give it and to dance for the renewal of the world. And yet, as Pico forcefully reminds us, that reciprocity cannot be sentimentalized or trivialized. Another quote from Pico. Let's say I live in NYC. Let's say I was the first person in my family to graduate college. Let's say, ugh, I like watching New Girl on Hulu. This is the difference. Some see objects in the earth, where I see lungs. Sky Mother falls through a hole, lands on a turtle. Hole is my favorite band. Indigenous cosmologies are ongoing. They stretch from hundreds of generations of Earth knowledge through the modern history of colonialism to our present day, where these knowledges exist next to everyday realities like television and popular music. So I wanted to end by turning to the author of the NEA Big Read, Joy Harjo, and to her first book of poetry, She Had Some Horses. And this is the book that I wrote about in my undergraduate thesis, and that in so many ways brought me to my career. This is her poem, Rain. Bobby flew out from his body on 9 Mile Hill. You could say it was a Navajo semi careening down the earth, or his wife, pregnant and drunk, who caused his lick of death. But what captured him was a light in the river, folding open and open, blood, heart, and stones shimmering like the Milky Way. And then it rained. What went down sucked the current, took hold. Now Southern California falls into the ocean. Now Phoenix struggles underwater. Something has been let loose in rain. It is teaching us to love. So thank you very much.
I'm sure Amy will take any questions from you if you have any.
What are we going to do about climate change?
Recognize our responsibility. Rethink what that responsibility means. If we follow the lead of these indigenous writers, it's about kinship, right? That it's a relationship that's not just about stewardship, which is how it often shows up in Western cultures, but it's where there's a hierarchy, but more really understanding of reciprocity and kinship, right? And I think to risk being a little bit sentimental, I think love, right? That there has to be that taking of responsibility and a shifting of what that responsibility might look like. How we get there? By reading, by listening. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Dr. Leslie Larkin.
I know you said you left a reading list back there, and I'm sure there were lots of texts that you would have liked to talk about today. What's one other author you think folks should read, or somebody else that you would
Well, I mean, I think I'll go for the low-hanging fruit for that one, because so this is from this, what I was reading tonight is largely drawn from this, as I said, this chapter, and there's another author in the chapter that I cut out just for time and to give you a break, and that's Linda Hogan, and her book, Solar Storms, I think is really an incredible book, and that's set in kind of southern Canada, and it looks at the damming of waterways and how that impacts, where the dam is, but then everything downstream, and connecting in kind of generations of one family to the water and to the kind of increasing encroachment into the water and into the land. It's a really wonderful book. It's one that I have taught several times, and my students tend to love it, so I think it's a good one for everyone to read. But yes, there is a reading list, and my I don't know what word I'm looking for, but the reading list, of course, is just 1 page long, and I could have been 100 pages long. So on that list are a lot of the books that I particularly love, but there are many more. It's just kind of a starting place.
Are there any other questions or comments? All right, let's give Amy another hand here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amy.
Thank you.
I've said it before, every time I stand up here after one of these keynote addresses, I feel really stupid because the people that come up here and speak are so passionate and so knowledgeable about their subjects. And that's one of the things that has been great about this entire NEA Big Read is that I've learned so much, and I continue to learn so much. And I'm certainly going to take that list home from Amy and start my way through that list. Of course, the NEA Big Read is not over yet. We have on Wednesday at the Marquette Regional History Center, we have Dr. Marty Reinhardt, who's going to be speaking about Indigenous people removal histories, which is going to be really fascinating. That starts at 7. And then this coming Saturday, we have an event if the grand piano is tuned and repaired in time, called Harmonies in Harjo, where students from the Department of Music from NMU read Joy Harjo's book and were inspired to pick certain pieces to accompany her poems. So we're going to have a mixture of poetry and music starting at 11 a.m. on Saturday here in the community room on the 13th. And of course, this is all a prelude to the big capstone event, which is coming next Monday night. We have a watch party here in the community room. So if you want to come, there's going to be a band here, a tribal progressive band. The lead singer is Marty Reinhardt, and it's fantastic. So he's going to be here. They're going to be performing from 6 to 7. And then close to 7 o'clock, I will sneak upstairs and get Joy Harjo, meet with Joy Harjo in a Zoom meeting, and it will be, you'll be able to watch it here on the big screen. I am taking questions. If you want to email me any questions that you would like me to pose to Joy Harjo at the end of her presentation, on Monday, all you have to do is email them to me. I'm going to work through as many of those as I can, and I promise you that I will try to probably, don't tell anybody, but if you send me, any of you guys want to send me something, I'll make sure your questions get asked, okay? So, yes.
Where is the November 10th Dr. Martin?
That brochure was printed before yes. That is not in the community room. It is in the Marquette Regional History Center. So Marty Reinhardt will be there. Yeah.
And that's at 7?
And that starts at 7 p.m. And that will also be live streamed to YouTube as well. So, yeah, I think that's what we have coming up. It's going to be a very big week. And after November 15th, I'm going to take a very long nap. But it suddenly became real this afternoon because I now have Joy Harjo's cell phone number in my contact list, which is kind of amazing. I just hope I don't butt dial her by mistake. That would be really embarrassing. So anyway, I really want to thank you all for coming, and please join us again Wednesday night for Marty Reinhardt's presentation at the Marquette Regional History Center. So have a good night. Thank you very much.